and we're an interdisciplinary program that that educates students in various disciplines, including social sciences and epidemiology and communications. And we're looking at the non-medical influences on health. So our seminar series has been quite popular. This is actually the last one for the spring semester. So happy students, there will be a class meeting at this time, same time, same place next week, but that won't be open to outsiders. But we'll reconvene again in the fall. And if you've come to a seminar, we've got your email address, so we'll let you know when we reconvene. So thank you so much for coming today. We're really looking forward to this talk, and I'm going to turn it over to Emily Quinn to introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fuberman. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Colin Carlson. He is an incoming assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology of Microbial Diseases at Yale University. His work explores the challenges faced by health systems in the Anthropocene with ongoing research projects focused on the legal, political, and scientific determinants of outbreak reporting and data sharing. Dr. Carlson, founder and executive director of Verena, a cross-university collaboration of over a dozen early career scientists, developed a data science-driven approach to assessing viruses pose a risk to human health and where, when, and why they might emerge in human populations. And prior to joining Yale University, Dr. Carlson was a research faculty at Georgetown University's Center for Global Health Science and Security, and earlier a postdoctoral fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center at the University of Maryland. He's also contributed to reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. He holds a PhD in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from the University of California, Berkeley, and most afternoons you can find him on the Capitol Crescent bike trail after work. So with that extensive background, I will turn it over to Dr. Carlson.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much for having me, folks. It's a pleasure to get to do this. There's some faces in the audience who I know from different stages in my life, which is always exciting. But yeah, it's great to be here. I'm going to talk with you guys today a little bit about climate change. That's the main topic. I do a lot of different things. I do work on emerging viruses. I do outbreak response. But today, what I sort of want to run you through is how we've been thinking about what public health looks like in a world that is a lot hotter than it used to be. And just to sort of ground that a little bit. So since the Industrial Revolution, our planet has warmed about 1.2 degrees. For where you can sort of place that in your head, the Paris Agreement obviously aims to limit warming at the end of the century to about 1.5 degrees. So that's the threshold that's sort of been used for a long time for dangerous climate change. So of course, all climate change is dangerous to some degree. It's a matter of scale and impact. But most scenarios say that we're probably going to pass 1.5 and then come back down, even if we meet the Paris Agreement targets. So the sort of hidden goal within Paris is to stay well under 2 degrees. At our current rate of warming, we're on track for about 3 degrees by the end of the century, which is enough to, among other things, drive thousands of species to extinction and submerge the National Mall under sea level rise. So it's worth, when we talk about a world with climate change, situating ourselves on that trajectory, right? We are no longer in a world where we get to write about or talk about climate change as a thing that will do blank. We live in a world with climate change. It is a present day thing that is affecting human health and ecosystems and our day-to-day lives. There's a lot more warming that's still to come in any possible scenario. There's a lot of things that we could do to reduce future warming. And when we talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change, the difference that we're talking about is still the difference between something approaching sort of a mass extinction of terrestrial biodiversity and life at 1.5, which is not super comfortable, but nowhere near as bad. The bottom line is, when I started doing what I do for a living, whatever that is, hopefully we'll find out by the end of the seminar, we really talked about climate change as a future risk, and it's not anymore. But one of the problems that we have is we don't actually have a sense of the present day health impacts of climate change. We mostly know things about the future. Most of what's been written is sort of these forecasting studies that say, here's what will happen in 2050 or 2100. We don't really know about today. There is one set of studies that have tried to take a stab at this problem. They were published 20 years ago now, which is way too long to have gone without updating these numbers. Again, to situate that in terms of sort of warming trajectories, when these reports were written, the world was 0.6 degrees warmer. We're now at twice that, right? But this pair of studies was led by Anthony McMichael, an Australian epidemiologist, back in 2003 and 4. And what they did is they said, okay, we're going to take all of these future models that people use to sort of figure out for each degree of warming, how many more people will die of malnutrition or malaria. And we're just going to multiply that out to today, because they understood that we live in a world that is already a bit warmer because of climate change. And so they estimated that as of the year 2000, 166,000 people were dying each year because of climate change. Now, that seems like a small number. In the grand scale of, there's 7 billion people on this planet. People die of thousands of different causes. Most, major infectious diseases have a higher burden than that, right? But I want to sort of take a second and talk about what that number means. So it's been 20 years since these numbers were updated. If you assume that that same rate has been true this entire time, that would mean that this year we are going to pass 4 million deaths from climate change. 4 million deaths would be more than the total death count of every WHO public health emergency of international concern up till COVID. It would be on the same scale as sort of COVID death toll from the first year on the record, though we now know it's much higher. 4 million deaths is also a massive direct financial cost to the world. Depending on what numbers you use and how you want to multiply it out, you can say that that's something like a $30 trillion cost to the global economy, right? So 166,000 deaths a year adds up pretty quick. And the other problem is that number is also completely wrong because it's, first of all, 20 years out of date, right? It was designed for a world that's half as warm as today. And we know that the relationship between warming and impacts is nonlinear, right? The hotter it gets, the worse impacts get proportionally. But also this study only captured a few causes of death, right? So they looked at primarily things that affect young children. So they looked at malnutrition, diarrheal disease, malaria. They put in floods and sort of a weird proxy for heat deaths in the form of cardiovascular disease. Those numbers don't make a ton of sense. They're super out of date. The bottom line is none of that actually really reflects what we now know about climate change, which is that it's affecting everything around us. It affects every category of mortality risks. We know that potentially millions of people have died just directly from heat impacts, let alone dozens of infectious diseases, storms, floods, secondary impacts from malnutrition, from conflict, right? The further out you get, the higher that death toll gets. And so that brings me to sort of the challenge that my group thinks about, which is how we actually measure all of this stuff. And one of the big problems that we have is most of the work that's happening in our field is focused on the things that are easy to measure. We talk about this as something called streetlight bias. So there's an old joke that's been handed down to my family, and I saw Carol Tavris in the audience. Carol wrote a book on psychology with my grandmother that's incredibly popular and has been used for decades. So this joke is from my grandmother. So that's a fun little connection. So there's a guy who's dropped a contact lens under somewhere outside a bar. He's crawling around on the ground, and a series of people, this is normally a much longer joke, a series of people come up and offer to help this guy. They ask all the wrong questions, right? They say, oh, what color is it? Or what were you doing when you dropped it? And then eventually a rabbi comes up to this man who's crawling around under a street lamp, and he says, well, where did you drop it? And the guy points off into the darkness. And the rabbi says, well, why are you looking here? And the guy says, well, it's light here. And that's sort of how scientific research works. We can't all be rummaging around in the dark all of the time. And so a lot of the things that we know about health and climate change are about the things that are easy to study, right? They're about the things that are easy to connect back to climate change. So it's very easy for us to study heat mortality from climate change because we can measure that, right? We can look at all-cause mortality and temperature and then pretty quickly estimate how many people have died. But when we get into these more complicated things, and particularly things where there's more ecology at play, right? We're talking about disease vectors or animals or livestock. We're talking about, how droughts cascade through to cause malnutrition and famines, right? When we're talking about things where human behavior changes, like HIV/AIDS or respiratory diseases like influenza, those are the things that are hardest for us to study. But they're also the places where the impacts could be biggest, right? If we're talking about a small proportional change on things with a massive mortality impact, that can still be a huge impact. And so what our group tries to do is make sense of this problem. And so I want to tell you a story about how we've done that in one case. It took us about 6 years to do this. And the hope, when you do this as a scientist is that the first time you do it, it takes a really long time. And the second time you do it faster and ideally with grant funding. But the first time we did this, it was mostly weekends and evenings. So to set the stage for this a little bit, so we're going to talk about malaria. Malaria is an interesting problem for us in terms of climate change work. Obviously, a incredibly high mortality disease globally, high burden on women and children, something that has historically been strongly associated with climate change because it's mosquito-borne, because it primarily affects people in sub-Saharan Africa. But we actually just don't have that much evidence of how present-day malaria risk is changing. A few years back, I had a really talented student in a seminar that we were teaching here at Georgetown, Ellen Bannon, and she came to me and she said, I really want to look at the mosquitoes that spread malaria. I want to figure out if they're going uphill because all the climate change literature says, mosquitoes should be moving uphill. They're following rising temperatures, right? Every animal and plant on Earth should be doing this to some degree, right? Everything's moving towards the poles into higher elevations to get away from the heat. She said, I really want to see if we can show that mosquitoes are doing this. And I said, I'd love to know the answer to that, but I don't think there's any data out there that we could use. And she said, no, I already have data. And she pulled up a huge Excel file. And this is such a quintessential Georgetown moment, I feel like. So it turns out that basically folks who have been studying malaria for 20 years, around 2017, decided to dump all of the data they've spent decades pulling together on just a far corner of the internet where no one had noticed. And Ellen had found this and basically set up the perfect study to actually go test something that's foundational to how we understand malaria and climate change, but we've never tested, which is, are mosquitoes moving? And so the hypothesis here is really simple. You can see it on these little graphs. As time goes on, we should see these mosquitoes at higher elevations and we should see them at higher latitudes. Ready? There they go. So some of these species have moved hundreds of kilometers since 1900. They've moved thousands of meters up in elevation. This isn't a huge surprise, right? This is how climate change is supposed to be affecting life on Earth. But as with a lot of things about climate change, it was just a prediction until we sat down to measure it and say, this is already happening. It has been happening for decades. So that's great news for us, right? We know something about climate change with a lot more confidence than we knew it 20 minutes ago. But the problem is this is just the mosquitoes, right? We can't really say anything about disease risk based on this. And so what we set out to do back at the end of 2018 is start turning this into an understanding of disease risk. Now, it turns out that that is the worst idea we could have ever had, because people have already been thinking about this, and most of them are pretty angry at each other right now. This is sort of a debate in public health that is unlike anything I've ever seen in really any field. It's been going since the late 1990s. Essentially, what happened in the sort of deep lore of this is around the late 80s, early 90s, in a couple communities in East Africa, clinicians started to see suddenly malaria come back. The sort of most famous example of this is this tea plantation in Kericho, Kenya, where we have records that go back actually to the start of the 1900s. And malaria had been sort of not absent, but at a very low equilibrium for decades. And then in the 80s, it started to come back, and we saw these major epidemics. Now, this is the early days of people figuring out what climate change was and how it works. And so a few people floated the idea that this might be climate change. And the malaria community reacted incredibly strongly and negatively, for what turns out to be a very good reason, which is, as with anyone who works on disease eradication, the great enemy is shifting funding, right? I was at a meeting yesterday with some folks who are part of the International Task Force on Disease Eradication. They were talking about guinea worm, and someone said, we just need to remember that it's important that the guinea worm gets eradicated before the program gets eradicated. And the folks who were working on malaria were worrying about exactly this, right? They'd spent decades building relationships in communities, achieving progress towards disease eradication, and focus was constantly shifting around in health systems and international finance. And they were worried that if everybody started paying attention to climate change, all of the funding and all of the attention would shift to climate change rather than to continuing to provide essential health services, right? To continuing to pay for bed nets, for treatment. There's also other hypotheses for why malaria came back at this time. Part of it could just be that interventions weren't being funded at scale. Part of it is the emergence of drug resistance, which has been a really big problem. So there were other explanations for what was going on. And this led to a massive debate within the field. It's the closest I think I've ever seen like peer-reviewed scientific literature get to outright climate denial. So you can see there's a paper there from 2003 called Hot Topic or Hot Air, Climate Change and Malaria Resurgence in the East African Highlands. People were calling this dangerous pseudoscience, and this has been debated basically for 2 decades. Almost all of these debates have been about this one time series data set from Kenya. That's not a great way to figure out what's been going on a continent with 1 billion people on it. And so what we set out to do is come up with something a little bit broader in view and a little bit more definitive. It turns out that when the Malaria Atlas Project dumped all of those mosquito records online, they also put up all of their clinical studies. And so this paper from 2018, led by Bob Snow, one of the sort of great malaria epidemiologists, documented these changes since 1900, and they showed that malaria has gone up and down through time. And what's been really interesting is that there are dynamics that can't really be explained by climate. They also can't really be explained by intervention. It's not really clear where they come from. It's probably just that things are complicated. You have human mobility, you have shifting governments, you have improvements in diagnostics that lead to weird artifacts in your data, right? Their point was just, this is really complicated. We can't know if it's climate. We can't know if it's this or that. But as someone who works on climate change, this paper is very frustrating for me because the way that they check if it is climate change, and you can see this on that x-axis, is they take the average temperature and rainfall for all of Africa in 5 or 10-year increments, and they line it up with the average malaria prevalence, and they say, I don't know, do those things look like they go together? That's not how we do science. And so we set out to look at their data and actually try to do something a little bit more definitive. The thing is that Bob Snow is right. It is incredibly hard to know why there's variation in this data. When we are doing a study like this, what we are constantly fighting is different sources of noise and different trends that are not the trend we're interested in. So for example, there's some amount of shifting baselines of disease burden that's just random, or there's just sort of diseases are where they are due to historical legacies and where eradication is focused and things like that. A huge amount of the variation we see has to do with socioeconomic factors, access to healthcare, poverty, things like that. Then there's some amount of climate influence, but not all of that has to do with human influence on the climate system. So for example, malaria is seasonal in a lot of Africa, right? And that is clearly driven by climate, but it's not necessarily driven by human-caused climate change. There's also other forms of climate variability through time. There are cycles in the climate system, there are volcanic eruptions. And so what we talk about is this idea of detection and attribution, right? Being able to look at a particular impact, trace it back to its cause, and actually say, here is the health impact that is attributable to, and I'm going to use this phrase very specifically, human-caused climate change. So we put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We change the reflectivity of the earth with agriculture. We do different things on the climate system. It made the planet get a specific amount hotter. What's the health impact we can trace just to that? This used to be impossible to do, but there's a field of climate science called attribution science that has gotten very good at doing this with weather in the last few years. And the reason they've done this, I think, is a really compelling one. So for those of you who've been following the climate crisis for a couple decades, I always think back to Hurricane Katrina, right? After Katrina especially, and then, other major storms since, there's sort of this visceral sort of sensory memory for a lot of climate scientists of getting calls from journalists, and they say, well, was this climate change? And you're not allowed to say, yes, that was climate change, because we don't know, right? What you have to say is, well, we can't know with any individual event if that's climate change. We just know that there'll be more events like this, or that events like this will get worse. That's really unsatisfying, right? Because when the public comes to you and they say, hey, I lost my home, or I lost a loved one, was that climate change? You want to be able to give them an answer, right? You want to be able to situate these tragedies, the human cost of climate change, in a way that people can understand. So attribution science emerged as an area where we are now able to look at specific events and actually say what the influence of climate change was. So for example, Hurricane Harvey, we can now say that probably there was about 15% more rainfall in that event because of climate change, or that a storm like that was 3 times more likely. So that event still could have happened without climate change, but climate change made it worse, right? There are also events now that literally could not have happened without influence on the climate system. So if you have an event that was made, 1,000 times more likely because of human influence, if you have an event that you run 1,000 simulations of the world up to this point without human influence, and it never happens, and then you put humans in the equation and suddenly you start getting these massive storms or these massive heat waves, then you can be really sure. And so, for example, last summer was a very unusual time for our Earth's climate system. We saw heat waves that were completely unprecedented. And scientists can look at those events through these sort of simulation methods and say, there is basically no way this could have happened without human influence. So what we want to do is we want to take these tools from attribution science and apply them to human health, right? We want to help people understand how their health is changing because of climate change. This is a new area. It's experimental. When we started doing this, no one had really done it yet. But people can do this now. Like I said, the easiest place to do this is places where the relationship between climate and your health outcome is very clear. So, for example, we can really easily study the relationship between heat waves and heat-related deaths. And we really understand the relationship between rising global temperatures and heat waves. So, for example, this study by Ana Cabrera, brilliant study, one of the best studies on climate change I think ever published, managed to count up. There are thousands of deaths every year that we can look at and say, this is clearly the influence of climate change. About 37% of deaths right now that are during basically heat waves are because of human influence. We can count those deaths. We can report them to national governments. We can say, this is how many people have died in your country at a minimum because of climate change. We just finished an amazing project with the Wellcome Trust trying to figure out who's done what with these tools. And maybe unsurprisingly, there's only about a dozen of these studies so far, and almost all of them have been on heat. There's been a couple on storms, like Hurricane Harvey, but when we started this, no one had done anything on infectious disease. So that's where we come in. We tried to do the first detection and attribution study to figure out infectious disease burden from human-caused climate change. I'm going to skip this. You guys don't need to know about that. Let's talk about malaria. So here's how we actually do this under the hood. I'm not going to get into all the nuances. What I will say is we can only do this through interdisciplinary collaborations. So you need 3 people in the room to do this. You need someone who understands malaria. That was my job on this paper. You need someone who understands climate change. That was 2 people's job on this paper, Chris and Remark at University of Cape Town. And you need someone who knows how to really confidently figure out causation. And it turns out economists are really good at this. And so Tama Carlton brought in this econometric framework that we use, which is quite cool. And here's how those pieces come together. We start with our data set. They say, here's 100 years of malaria clinical studies. There's about 55,000 prevalence surveys in this data set. So we're talking about millions and millions of children that have been tested for malaria over the last 100 years. We build a model that tells us how climate is driving trends in those data. But where the econometric approach comes in that I think is quite cool is we start by trying to cancel out every other potential source of variation. So we kill random variation through time. We kill random variation in space. We account for when the global malaria eradication program was going from 1955 to 69, right? We try to take all of the confounders out and all of the other sources of noise out so that what we're left with, we are absolutely sure is climate. And then what we do, this is the big secret to attribution science, if you've been wondering how it works, is we simulate the world 1,000 times as it actually happened. So 1900 to present, real climates, real simulations. And then we go back and we turn off the Industrial Revolution. And we simulate the world without human influence 1,000 times. And so this gives us a counterfactual scenario, right? Where volcanic eruptions still happen, where there's still El Nino and all of these sort of year-to-year variations, but we're not in the picture. And what that lets us do is it lets us compare factual to counterfactual and say, here is the direct impact of human influence on the climate system. So here's what we found. There are about 84 excess cases of childhood malaria per every 100,000 children today because of climate change. That's not 84 cases per 100,000 cases. That's 84 cases per 100,000 children, which is a pretty high number, right? Another way to say that is that the prevalence of childhood malaria increased by 0.8% because of climate change. Now, you got to remember, malaria prevalence is decently low these days. The continent-wide average is around 15 to 20% in different places, right? So a 1% increase is pretty sizable. But here's what's really interesting. When we go back to Bob Snow's studies, it turns out that the cumulative impact of interventions is about 200 times the impact of climate change. And this is why it's been so hard for people to resolve these debates, right? We're looking for an incredibly small increase concealed inside a massive decrease. We've made huge progress towards eliminating malaria. It's just been a little bit slower than it was supposed to be. That was climate change. And so there's a couple lessons here. First, climate change has increased malaria. We can say that now with absolute confidence, which is good news because we can't do another 20 years of debate on that. Second, interventions work, right? This immediately tells us that we have the tools in hand to deal with the impacts of climate change and then some. We can get a little more granular with this. So we go back to Karacho and we say, at a sort of continental level, there's about a 2/3 chance that the net effect of climate change was positive. This is why we do 1,000 simulations, right? So that we can get a really clear sense of how certain we are. We're pretty sure that the overall impact has been an increase in malaria. But in Karacho, we are very sure. High elevation communities in East Africa, high latitude communities in Southern Africa, we can say with really high confidence, climate change has been increasing malaria in those communities. But there's also, interestingly, a big chunk of the Sahel and parts of Southern Sudan where climate change has decreased malaria already because it's getting too hot. This is why we need to be able to do these sort of continental-sized models, right? We can't infer from one community what the total impact has been across the entire continent. Last little thing I'll say, I'm not going to talk about the future too much in this talk, but I want to say a little bit about it. One of the big reasons that this has been so hotly debated for so long is that when we run studies where we try to predict the future, we see that the continent will, in most places, get too hot for malaria. Not enough to completely preclude transmission, but enough that the net effect should be a reduction, right? Mosquitoes are sort of like little Rube Goldberg machines. They're ectothermic, right? And so that means because they're cold-blooded, every process inside a mosquito is operating on a timescale set by temperature. The number of eggs that they lay, the amount of time that they live, the amount of time it takes for an egg to become an adult, how quickly the malaria parasite goes in through the mouth parts and infects the mosquito, all of that is on a clock that is set by temperature. And if it's too hot or if it's too cold, you see less transmission. This is true of most mosquito-borne diseases. There's sort of an optimum temperature. For malaria, that temperature is actually surprisingly low. It's only 25 degrees Celsius. For comparison, for dengue, which is really well adapted to live in the tropics, it's probably closer to somewhere in the 28 to 30 range. But for malaria, because it has this really low peak temperature, yes, we will see in the future if our planet heats up a massive amount, we will see huge reductions in malaria transmission. One of the challenges we've had is how do we reconcile the idea that malaria is increasing today, but it'll decrease massively in the future, right? Those seem like they're in contradiction, a lot like this idea that, well, how could we have an increase in malaria if it's decreased massively in the last two things? But, two things can be true at once, right? What's really nice about these attribution models is they let us look at continuous time. And so we can pretty easily solve that paradox. And the answer is, well, things have gone up a little bit and they'll continue to stay elevated a little bit, right? We'll see elevated malaria transmission for at least a couple decades, but it will continue to get hotter and then the trend will flip. So what do we do with that information? Well, first of all, it's good news for malaria eradication. Right. One of the challenges that we've had in terms of translating this is there's a lot of interest right now in malaria eradication within a generation. That is still on the table, even with climate change. We know the outer limits of what climate change impacts are going to be, and we know that eventually climate change is going to start pushing things in the other direction. But we also know that even in all of those futures where malaria is decreasing, we still see more malaria in those high elevation communities like Karachow, right? And so it's not one monotonic decrease. It's not everyone everywhere gets healthier. It's that malaria is getting pushed into places where we have less interventions, where we have less surveillance, right? So we can act on that information. So it took us 5 years to do that. And then we found an issue in the code and we had to rerun everything, and it took 6 years to do. And that's science. Where we are now is we're trying to figure out what we do next. Malaria was one of those 5 things in that McMichael study, right? It's something that's been a high priority for climate change research for decades. But there are dozens of other infectious diseases where we know that climate change is having an impact, and we know that doing these kinds of studies might have a really profound impact on how we respond to infectious disease. And I'll give you a couple examples. The one that's on my mind a lot lately is cholera. So it's been a really bad couple of years for cholera worldwide, partly because we've had major storms like Cyclone Freddy in Mozambique that have had major cholera outbreaks that follow them, but also just everywhere has seen more cholera lately. And this has been a big enough problem that the World Health Organization has actually had to change their vaccination strategy. So typically, the oral cholera vaccine is a two-dose regimen. That got suspended about a year ago because there's been a shortage of vaccine supply. Now, what was really interesting is that when the WHO changed their vaccination recommendations, they ran a press release where, on the record, they said, yeah, we're pretty sure this is climate change. There's no peer-reviewed literature yet to back that up. Now, we know that climate change is probably increasing cholera in some places. We know that cholera risk will increase in the future, right? But that idea of attribution, right? That idea of we can say that today there are excess cases of cholera. We have a vaccine shortage for cholera because of climate change. We don't have that study yet. Science is lagging so far behind in this space that it's not just lagging behind public policy, it's also lagging a bit behind intuition, right? When we see these massive cholera outbreaks everywhere, when we see unprecedented things happening to human health, it's often pretty obvious that it's climate change. But we haven't produced the primary literature to actually back up some of these plays that policymakers need to make. So that's a really big concern, right? That's something that we as scientists can try to solve. So cholera, a reasonable next target. Another example is dengue fever, right? We've years. In 2019, we had, I believe, record-breaking outbreaks in something like 30 countries. Everyone agrees that that's climate change. Even the people in the vector-borne disease space who are most cautious about what they say is climate change are like, yeah, that's climate change. We don't have that study yet. And so what we're trying to do as a group is really take stock of, what are the systems where we think this matters? What are the systems where we have the data? And that's usually a pretty big limitation. And what are the systems where we can do good by figuring out these numbers? And some of the hardest problems that are coming down the road are going to be the ones that are the hardest to model. So a big example of this is there's sort of a widespread belief that antimicrobial resistance may get worse with climate change. And there are studies that have shown that the frequency of AMR evolution does seem to respond to temperature, but it's going to be incredibly hard to demonstrate that that's true in this framework. And it'll be incredibly hard to count the deaths that result from it, even though that number could be quite high, right? So there's a lot of work to be done. And unfortunately, you could pump as much money into my lab as you want, and we wouldn't be able to do all of it. We could probably do 99% of it, but if you give us $100 million, if any of you have $100 million, please call me. We do need it. But there's so much work to be done, right? And it can't be one or two groups. It can't be, a dozen studies, right? That's all that we found when we did that literature review. We need a global community of practice working on this. And so when I think about that, I think back to the McMichael study, and I think back to what the field looked like in the early 2000s. The reason that they were able to sit down and do those original estimates is because they were part of the very first incarnation of the Global Burden of Disease study. And for those of you who don't know, the GBD study has been going on for about 25 years. It's currently a massive Gates-funded endeavor out of IHME that sort of tracks all of the different ways that people die all around the world and trends in public health. And it's a huge source of information for public decision making. The very first version of the GBD study wasn't, Gates funded at scale. It was an NIH U01. It was a little center grant. And that little center grant funded that first global burden of climate change study. Now, all of that field of sort of health metrics evaluation has grown out over the last 25 years, and no one ever came back to climate change. And so myself and some colleagues have been writing about this for a while. We think we really need a global burden of climate change study, right? We need a coordinated effort across countries, across different disciplinary frameworks, across diseases, to really sit down and say, okay, one standardized framework, the best tools we have, can we count the true mortality cost from climate change? Because right now the number we have is 4 million deaths based on an estimate from 20 years ago. And I would bet you any amount of money I have, which is essentially no money, but I would bet it to you for sure, that if we add up those numbers correctly, if we do it again, it could be 40 or 50 million deaths. It could be more, right? So we really need to think about solving these scientific problems at scale. It can't just be individual labs. All right. I want to say one more thing before we wrap this up. And because this is the Health and Public Interest program, I'm gonna take advantage of a little known fact, which is if you paid close attention to my bio at the start, you may have noticed that the word policy appears in the title of my PhD, which does mean that I get to say whatever I want all the time. And so we're going to go on a little sidebar into policy. A little story about the strange circumstances you find yourself in as a scientist sometimes. Back in 2019, before the world exploded, I got a phone call from a friend. I really viscerally remember this. I was on the Amtrak going somewhere, and she called me and she said, "Hey, I think someone just did something really weird with your work." So we had just published this big study showing where dengue risk is going to go in the future. And basically what we did is we looked at those temperatures where disease can be transmitted. We looked at where they are today and where they'll be in the future. And we can say, okay, dengue fever is going to spread into the US, into Europe, into parts of China that it's not currently in, up into the East African highlands. We'll see an intensification of transmission in a lot of places. We will even see parts of, the Amazon or Central Africa where it gets too hot some of the year. But overall, the net effect is 1 billion people will be exposed to dengue fever who weren't before. My friend had called me because Morgan Stanley had run a report that said, you're not going to believe this, 1 billion people are going to be at risk from dengue fever in the future. And we think that we can sell $125 billion of vaccines because of it. And she called me and she said, are those your numbers? And I said, uh-oh. So we did a little detective work and we got our hands on this report. And it turns out that what had happened here was, so I was co-lead of this study. The other lead had gotten one email from Morgan Stanley that said, hey, we had a question about this. Can you get on the phone with us? And she didn't know what it was and she ignored it. And so they had decided to write this entire report without speaking to us or checking any of the math. And they got the math right. but our numbers got used. So basically what they did is they said, okay, here's the billion people who are going to be exposed to dengue by 2050. Here's how much they'll pay for vaccines. And let's add that up. And the market valuation of that comes out to at least 125 billion, or depending on how you brand these things, maybe even 200 billion. There's a few problems here. So, first problem, the billion people who are going to be exposed to dengue may be willing to pay for vaccines, right? People in the US and Europe will maybe line up for that. But if they had spoken to someone who works on dengue, what a scientist would have told them is dengue is not going to kill Europeans. So dengue fever has this weird thing. If you don't know this, there's 4 types of dengue. And it only really is likely to kill you when you get the second type. It's a weird immune system thing called antibody-dependent enhancement. Basically, let's say you get dengue 1, your immune system learns dengue is dengue 1, and so it goes and it makes a bunch of antibodies for dengue 1, and then you get dengue 2, and your immune system says, I've seen this before, and it shoots out a bunch of stuff for dengue 1, which is not useful to anyone, and dengue 2 hemorrhages your system. That only happens in places where dengue is hyperendemic, like the tropics. And in the future, even with climate change, it will only happen in places where dengue is hyperendemic, like the tropics. So the people who are in that 1 billion, right? The people who are in the newly exposed category are not going to be the majority of dengue deaths, even in the future. Not just because they're primarily in high-income countries, not just primarily because they're in high-income countries where we have screens on the windows, which is another big reason we don't have mosquito-borne disease here, but because dengue isn't going to be hyperendemic in any of those places. The places where we're worried about dengue risk are those 30 countries where we had massive epidemics in 2019, right? It's going to be places like Peru. It'll be places like Nicaragua or Thailand. So these vaccines are all going to get sold to the wrong people. This is indicative of a much larger issue, right? And I think for any of us who worked on the pandemic, we all know what that issue is, which is that vaccines are not allocated well as a general concept. Intellectual property rights keep low and middle income countries from manufacturing their own vaccines. In major outbreak settings, global north countries tend to hoard vaccines and are unwilling to sell them to low and middle income countries. We saw all of this during the pandemic. And even if none of those things come true, right? Even if we manage to get dengue vaccine to the rest of the world, there's still something I think, this is where I get to pull out the policy in the PhD. There's something deeply nauseating about the idea of essentially a 1-2 punch in the colonial exploitation that leads you here, right? First, high-income countries caused the climate crisis and have caused mass death through the process of colonial resource extraction and fossil fuel industries. And then they're going to make another $200 billion selling vaccines to these countries for a problem they created. This can't be what public health looks like. This can't be what we let our research be used for. And there are solutions to this, right? What the COVID pandemic showed us is there are technical on-the-table options for how we fix this stuff. And so as we look to the future, we need to be thinking about not just dengue, but different sources of vaccination, right? There are at least a dozen of these diseases where we need to be thinking about updating vaccine stockpiles, like with cholera and yellow fever, where we need to be thinking about how to get countries the intellectual property rights and technical know-how to manufacture their own vaccines. We need to be thinking about what we can do in our research to ensure that people have access to the benefits of our research. And right now, one interesting development that I don't think is in these slides, but I'll just quickly mention because we're running out of time. The pandemic agreement that's being negotiated through WHO right now as of the last public draft, there's a mechanism in it called the pathogen access and benefit sharing system, which essentially exchanges vaccines for data sharing. So it ensures that high-income countries will give vaccines in the next public health emergency to WHO, and then WHO will be able to give them out to everyone else. In the last draft, that applied not just to pandemics, but any future public health emergency of international concern, which means that something like the Zika virus epidemic in the Americas would be on the table. And so if we're thinking about how to actually get vaccine into people's hands, there are options on the table right now that can solve these problems, right? These are not sort of monolithic injustices that are just part of living in a world with poverty. They are technical problems created by the global health security architecture with technical solutions. And part of what climate change adaptation will be, if we value health justice and health system strengthening, is talking about and solving those problems. All right. I will leave you with this. The margin between 4 million deaths and 40 million deaths is not set in stone, right? Part of the job that we have now is counting all of the deaths we haven't counted. But climate change is here. It is a present day health issue. And we can, through immediate action, be reducing the mortality cost of climate change. Health system strengthening is climate change adaptation. It is a way to turn the dial down on that 166,000 deaths a year. And every one of those deaths is two failures of leadership. It is a failure to cut greenhouse gas emissions. It is a failure to do something about health system strengthening in a world that needs more of it. These are solvable problems. I hope this got some gears turning for you. Happy to answer questions. Thank you for your time. And as always, thank you to all of the people who make this work possible, including a huge network of collaborators, my wonderful lab, who does a lot of this work, and of course, our beloved funders. Each and every one of them is like a perfect snowflake to me. Thanks for your time, and happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation, Colin. That was super interesting. It definitely at least got me thinking, I think, on like a new frontier of what climate change really means, and what it looks like. I'll definitely give the floor to HAPI students first and give them a chance to collect their thoughts. I know that we covered a lot of topics there, but one question I had in particular, especially kind of touching on what your like unique case with Morgan Stanley and seeing your data used in that way, us all like the HAPI students being in a field of public health and, you know, wanting to make a difference in different ways, like how do you maintain optimism and not just total fear of the future, like both with climate change, but then also seeing sort of like larger finance giants like a Morgan Stanley kind of thinking in a way of profit instead of like actual public health? How do you kind of navigate that space as we're going into our careers and want to stay optimistic as well?
Okay, I'm going to lean into the emotional side of this question because it is a much bigger part of the answer for me than I think maybe it would be if I were a healthier person. Um, I I hate talking about climate grief. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. Because it is my job to count how many people have died from climate change. And for some reason, it's not a lot of other people's jobs. It mostly seems to be mine these days. So the climate grief thing is incredibly real, but you have to find a place to put it. You can either put it in grief or you can put it in a different and much more useful bucket called anger. Um, when the Morgan Stanley thing happened, right? So that was summer 2019. I was furious. I was furious at my co-author for not answering that email. I was furious at Morgan Stanley. We've written multiple things through the years that have gotten published or been blog posts or not gotten published about, how messed up that was. I've been telling this story for half a decade now. And then I decided, okay, I actually need to figure out where to put this in a useful context. And so I ended up coming to the Center for Global Health Science and Security 6 months later, because I wanted to understand the systems that allow vaccines to be allocated that way, right? I wanted to understand the public policy side. I'm trained as an ecologist. I don't call myself an ecologist these days because it's not 95% of what I do. But I made the conscious choice. I said, okay, the systems that are using my science are using it in a way that I couldn't have predicted and I don't understand, and it's causing harm. So I need to go understand those systems. And I spent 5 years working at the center and learning about how we allocate vaccines and where these problems come from and what WHO's role in this and how the US government thinks about this. And now there's a place to put all of it. And so we're not just writing about it. We're not just writing about how bad things are. We are trying behind the scenes and sometimes very much above board to do something about it. And so a big example of this is that PAB system in the treaty. We wrote an open letter that was published last month in Nature with almost 300 scientists signing it from around the world that said, hey, this needs to stay in the treaty. There's a lot of, pharmaceutical companies pushing back on it, right? There's a lot of global north countries pushing back on it. As the scientists generating this data, we see this thing happening. It's important. We're drawing attention to it and we're saying there is no open science, there's no fair science without a system like this. And we don't get, sole credit or even 1% credit for this, right? But in the last month, IFPMA, the big sort of international pharmaceutical coalition, has changed their position on PABs and come around to it and stopped publicly fighting against it. Now, whether they're doing bad things behind the scenes is anyone's guess, but we can make progress on these things. So my short answer is get mad, learn how systems work.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. I definitely, not to speak for the group, but I think all of us have felt angry at one time or another with something we've learned in this program. So that's really helpful. Jasmine?
Hi, thanks so much for this super insightful discussion. So my question relates directly to one of the data pieces that you went over. On you're mentioning mosquitoes have a temperature clock and they have an optimal temperature. And so the results on like malaria being coordinated with climate change, wouldn't that imply that like transmission could have slowed because it was too hot as well?
Yeah, so there's definitely places where that has happened. So I didn't pull this forward super much in the talk, but in West Africa especially, and particularly in cities in West Africa where you have sort of an urban heat island effect on top of the warming that's already happened, we do definitely think that there's been a small reduction. So when we see that sort of 1% increase across the continent, what that actually is a 2% increase in some places and a 1% decrease in some places. So it's shifting burdens, it's sort of moving from place to place. And so one of the challenges that we face now is being able to translate that in a local context, right? We don't want people to walk away with climate change is making malaria worse in Africa. We want to be able to sit down with decision makers in, Nigeria CDC and say, hey, you have a little bit of an assist here from climate on elimination in West Africa. Let's talk about what to do with that. And then conversely, sit down with folks in East Africa and say, hey, things are going to get much harder for you very quickly in the next 10 years. So it's about that localization.
It's helpful, thank you.
Just to quickly answer that question in the chat, looking at sort of the equity overlay. God, we really want to. So one thing we know from some of these heat wave studies is that there are incredibly disproportionate impacts on different populations of heat waves. There's a big study that came out of Switzerland that was just used actually in a European Court of Justice proceeding, looking at heat mortality from the last 50 years of heat waves, and elderly women are dying at something like twice the rate of the baseline population. And so there's this court case that was brought to the ECJ from a group of older women who said, hey, this is not, our country is not meeting their human rights obligations for us. And they won. So the big frontier for this work is actually figuring out who is dying, not just how many people, and figuring out how to talk about that overlay of sort of intersectionality and different systems of health and equity.
Great, thank you. Another question I had was just in your research and everything you've been exploring, what role do you think technology plays, like that it's just developing at such a fast pace in either helping kind of solve this problem or in some ways also exacerbating it in terms of like production, things like that? Do you see any holes it can fill, or is it also at the same time kind of making it worse?
That's a good question. I could do 5 hours on that. The short answer is there are a lot of possible futures, right? Um, AI stuff, a lot of it is fake and nonsense and bad. I'm acknowledging that up front. But how our society handles even the fake and bad parts of it is going to be one of the things that sets us on a particular trajectory in the next 10 years. This is also true of advances in biomedical tech from during the pandemic, right? mRNA vaccines being developed for things other than COVID is the single biggest game changer for that part of my work, right? This idea that there are other diseases that might suddenly have a vaccine that didn't before. Um, there are a lot of possible futures, and there are people who spend their entire career studying those. There's a whole part of climate science that looks at things called the shared socioeconomic pathways, which are sort of these narratives that we're constantly competing about how the world could go. What I'll pull forward from that field is everything is connected, right? There's no good technology and bad technology scenario. There's a scenario where the dominant force is nationalism and state isolationism, and that leads to a different use of technology and different disparities in who has access to technology, right? So I think the broader thing is just everything that happens in the tech world is on a backdrop of politics and power, and that means that we can choose how things go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It was really helpful. Everything's not set in stone just yet.
You're right.
I'll definitely open the floor if anybody else in the group has any other questions outside of HAPI students. I know we had one in the chat. One question that came to mind, what that I was thinking about as well. I know you said you have an ecological background. I think sometimes, at least in the US, we get so focused like on our own like experiences and how climate, like we might not be feeling the impacts of climate change in the same way that other parts of the world are. But when you were saying, for example, that like the National Mall in X number of years could be underwater, like what are some of the impacts that you wish people were thinking about when it comes to climate change? Because I think on the surface, we might think like, oh, we have rising sea levels, so then people have to move in geography and things like that. But I think it's like such a bigger problem that people might not even be able to wrap their head around. What is something you wish people understood about that?
So the way I got into climate change research was I used to, a long time ago, study extinction, which was too depressing. So I do this for a living instead. You want to talk about optimism? Sometimes the answer is you find an easier problem to work on. So I haven't been in the extinction world for a few years, but I will share one thing that has really stuck out to me. So in the last IPCC report, there's a statistic, and it comes from my friend Chris, who did the climate science on our malaria paper, a different paper that he wrote. What they did in this study was they looked at when species will be exposed to climates they've never been exposed to before in history. So we talk a lot about sort of like projecting where animals will go, right? But we don't talk as much about, okay, this species is here today. When will it experience a temperature it's literally never lived through? And they did that for 30,000 species around the world. And that gives you a sense of extinction risk, right? The statistic that has really stayed with me from that, I don't remember, the average year that species are exposed. I don't remember the percent of species that are exposed. I remember one thing, which is that for species that are endemic to islands, the number is 100%. Every single species that lives on an island around the world is about to be exposed to a climate it has never lived through in its evolutionary history. We have no idea what that means in terms of extinction rates. Islands have always been hotspots of extinction. For birds, we've studied this really closely, and there's sort of a 10-to-1 difference in extinction rates between islands and the mainland, but things catch up on the mainland eventually, right? Islands are sentinels for what's happening in the rest of the world. So if 100% of island endemic species Galapagos tortoises and Darwin's finches and every lemur on Madagascar, if 100% of those are going to live through a climate that is dangerous and that they've never been exposed to, I think that really tells us something about how bad the future could be. And again, that's in that 3-degree scenario, right? So this is the difference between meeting our commitments on the Paris Agreement and living in the slightly better than it was, but still pretty bad world we've managed to build so far. There's a lot of work left to do. And there's a lot of science left to do on all of that. And if you're thinking about a career in ecology, please go into it. It's a great field, and I don't do it anymore, so someone needs to. Please go figure out the extinction stuff.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Any other final questions from the audience? It seems like no. I know someone asked if there would be a recording of the seminar, and there will be on YouTube, but if nobody has any final questions, thank you for such a great talk, Colin. This was super informative. Definitely got me thinking in a lot of different ways. So very appreciative for you and your work and your time. So thank you.
Thanks so much for
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, you too.